The clock on the wall read 6:45 in the evening, and every muscle in her body knew it. She'd been on her feet since 10 that morning, carrying plates, refilling drinks, and forcing smiles even when her tips barely covered the effort. The Italian restaurant was finally winding down from the lunch rush that had somehow stretched into early dinner service. She grabbed a damp cloth and started wiping down the corner booth where a family of 6 had just left. Bits of pasta and breadcrumbs were scattered across the red vinyl seats. As she worked, she caught her reflection in the window. 27 years old, wearing the same black pants and white button-up shirt she'd worn 3 shifts this week already. There was a small stain near the collar that wouldn't come out no matter how many times she washed it. This wasn't supposed to be her life. At least not the whole thing. The waitressing was supposed to be temporary, just until she got her music career off the ground. That's what she'd told herself 3 years ago when she first started at this place. 3 years. The thought made her stomach tighten. She finished with the booth and carried a tray of dirty dishes back to the kitchen. The heat hit her face as she pushed through the swinging doors. The cook was singing along to the radio, some pop song she'd heard 1,000 times. He gave her a tired wave. Everyone who worked here had that same exhausted look by the end of a shift. Back in the small break room, she finally untied her apron. Her feet throbbed as she sat down on the plastic chair. She pulled out her phone to check the time. If she left now, she could get home by 7:30, maybe eat something quick and then practice piano for a couple hours before bed. She needed the practice. There was a small showcase at a coffee shop next month, and she'd promised herself she'd finally perform some of her original pieces. The problem was, she was too tired to practice most nights. By the time she got home, all she wanted to do was collapse on her couch. The piano in her tiny apartment would sit there, waiting, and she'd feel guilty about not touching it. Some nights she'd sit down and try to play, but her fingers felt heavy and her mind couldn't focus. The music that used to flow so naturally felt stuck somewhere inside her. She was just reaching for her purse when her manager stuck his head into the break room. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he needed something. "Hey, I know you've been here since this morning," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But Rachel just called in sick for the evening shift. I really need someone to cover. Just until close." Her heart sank. That meant 4 more hours. 4 more hours of smiling and carrying heavy trays and pretending she was happy to bring someone extra Parmesan cheese. 4 more hours of her feet screaming and her back aching. 4 more hours away from her piano. "I don't know," she started to say, but he was already talking about the tips. Friday evening could be good money, he said. The dinner crowd usually tipped better than lunch. She could probably make an extra $100, maybe more if she was lucky. She thought about her bank account. Rent was due in a week. Her student loans from music school took a chunk of her paycheck every month. Those loans were for a degree she wasn't even using, not really. She'd studied piano performance, spent 4 years learning theory and technique and history, and now she spent her days carrying plates of spaghetti. "Okay," she heard herself say. "I'll do it." Her manager's face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." She didn't feel like a lifesaver. She felt like someone who couldn't say no, who couldn't afford to say no. She tied her apron back on and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and tried to summon up some energy for another 4 hours. The evening shift started slowly. A few couples came in, settling into the dim lighting and soft atmosphere of the restaurant at night. The place looked different after dark. The owners had strung little white lights along the walls and candles flickered on each table. It was supposed to be romantic, she guessed. A place for date nights and anniversaries. As she took orders and brought out baskets of breadsticks, her eyes kept drifting to the corner of the dining room. That's where the piano sat. A beautiful grand piano, all black and glossy, its curves elegant even in the dim light. It had been there since she started working at the restaurant, and in 3 years she'd only heard it played maybe a dozen times. The owners hired a pianist for special events sometimes, weddings or holiday parties, but most nights it just sat there like an expensive piece of furniture. She'd asked once if she could play it during her break. Her manager had seemed confused by the question, like he'd forgotten the piano could actually be used. He'd said maybe another time when it wasn't so busy. That was 2 years ago, and she'd never asked again. Every time she walked past it, though, she felt a little pull in her chest. She knew what those keys would feel like under her fingers. She knew the weight of them, the responsiveness of a good instrument like that. Her apartment piano was old and slightly out of tune, with a sticky key in the middle register, but this piano was beautiful. She'd stood next to it once during a private party, close enough to see her reflection in the polished wood. The evening crowd picked up around 7:30. More couples filtered in, and a few business dinners were wrapping up in the back section. She fell into the rhythm of service, her body moving automatically through the motions she'd done thousands of times. Take the order, smile, bring the food, check back, clear the plates, bring the check, over and over. Her feet hurt worse now than they had after the lunch shift. There was a burning sensation in her heels that she knew would turn into blisters by the end of the night. Her lower back ached from carrying heavy trays. But the tips were decent, she had to admit. One couple left her $25 on a $60 check. Small victories. As 8 o'clock approached, she noticed an older gentleman sitting alone at a table near the window. He'd been there for a while, taking his time with his meal. There was something gentle about the way he sat, the way he carefully cut his food into small pieces. He had silver hair and wore a sweater vest that looked soft and well-worn. When she came to refill his water, he looked up at her with kind eyes and thanked her in a quiet voice. Most customers barely looked at her. She was just part of the background, someone to bring food and take away plates. But this man looked at her like she was a real person, like he actually saw her. It was such a small thing, but it made her stand a little straighter. She had no idea that this quiet man sitting alone would change everything, that in just a few minutes, a simple conversation would set something in motion that she'd been waiting for her whole life. Sometimes the biggest moments start with the smallest gestures, and sometimes all it takes is someone asking the right question at exactly the right time. She was balancing 3 plates on her arm when she noticed the older gentleman waving her over gently. She delivered the food to table 7 first, then made her way back to him. He'd finished his meal and was sitting there with his coffee, looking thoughtful. "Everything okay with your dinner?" she asked, pulling out her order pad out of habit. "Oh yes, wonderful," he said with a warm smile. "But I wanted to ask you something, if you have a moment." She glanced around the restaurant. Things were steady but not crazy. She could spare a minute. "Sure, what can I help you with?" He gestured toward the corner where the grand piano sat. "That piano over there. Does anyone ever play it?" She followed his gaze to the instrument. "Sometimes," she said. "The owners hire someone for special events. Weddings, parties, things like that. But not usually on regular nights like tonight. It mostly just sits there." He nodded slowly and something sad passed across his face. "I was hoping there might be music tonight," he said quietly. "This restaurant holds very special memories for me." There was something in his voice that made her pause. She wasn't in a rush suddenly. "What kind of memories?" she asked. The old man's eyes got a faraway look. 40 years ago today, I proposed to my wife right here. At that table by the window, actually." He pointed to a spot 2 tables over. They had a pianist playing that night. Nothing fancy, just gentle music in the background. But I can still hear it when I close my eyes. The song that was playing when she said yes, her chest tightened. "That's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "She passed away last year," he continued, his voice steady but soft. "I came here tonight because I wanted to feel close to her again. Silly, I suppose, but I thought if I could hear the piano, maybe it would bring back that feeling. That moment when everything was ahead of us and anything seemed possible." She didn't know what to say. All day long people asked her for things. Extra napkins, more bread, another glass of wine. Small, forgettable requests that blended together into background noise. But this was different. This man wasn't asking for anything, really. He was just sharing a piece of his heart with a waitress he'd never met before. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she finally said. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them deeply. He smiled at her. "Thank you, dear. Don't mind an old man being sentimental. I'll take my check whenever you're ready." She walked away from his table with a strange feeling in her chest, something between sadness and something else she couldn't quite name. She thought about being married to someone for 40 years and then losing them. She thought about love that strong, that lasting. She thought about coming back to a restaurant on your anniversary just to remember. At the server station, she rang up his check and stared at the receipt printer as it churned out the paper. Her mind was spinning. The piano was right there. She could play. She'd been playing since she was 6 years old. She'd spent 4 years in music school. She performed at recitals and small venues around the city. Well, she used to, before she got too tired and too busy just trying to survive. But this wasn't a recital or a performance. This was just an old man who wanted to hear music on his anniversary. An old man sitting alone in a restaurant, holding on to memories of his wife. Before she could talk herself out of it, she found her manager in the back office doing paperwork. "Hey," she said from the doorway. "Can I ask you something kind of weird?" He looked up from his computer. "Weirder than staying for a double shift?" "Maybe." She took a breath. "There's a customer out there, and it's his anniversary. His late wife's anniversary. They got engaged here 40 years ago when a pianist was playing. He's here alone tonight, and I was thinking, would it be okay if I played the piano for a few minutes? During my break?" Her manager blinked at her. "You play piano?" "I do. I studied it in college. I mean, I'm not hired to do it or anything, but I could play something nice, just for a little bit." He seemed genuinely surprised. "I had no idea you played. How long have you worked here?" 3 years. 3 years, he shook his head. "You know, I don't see why not. It's not super busy, and it might be nice for the atmosphere." "Sure, go ahead." "Take your break." She felt a rush of nervousness immediately. "Okay, thanks." "Wait," he called as she turned to leave. "You're really good, right? I mean, you're not going to sound like my nephew at his first recital or something." Despite her nerves, she smiled. "I'm decent. I promise I won't clear out the restaurant." Walking toward the piano felt surreal. She passed the old man's table and caught his eye. "Would you mind waiting a few more minutes before you go?" she asked. He looked confused. "Of course, but why?" "Just trust me." Her hands were shaking as she approached the piano. She couldn't believe she was doing this. She was still wearing her work uniform, complete with that stubborn stain near the collar. There was probably sauce or something on her shirt from carrying plates all night. Her hair was coming loose from the ponytail she'd tied it in that morning. She looked like exactly what she was, an exhausted waitress at the end of a long shift. But when she sat down on the piano bench, something shifted. The keys were smooth and cool under her fingertips. She pressed down gently, testing the feel of the instrument. It was perfectly tuned. The sound was rich and full, even with the softest touch. This was a quality instrument, maybe even better than the ones she'd practiced on in music school. A few customers glanced over, curious about what was happening in the corner. She tried to ignore them. Her heart was pounding. She hadn't performed for anyone in months. What if she messed up? What if her fingers were too stiff from not practicing? What if she was so tired that she couldn't remember the pieces she knew by heart? She thought about the old man sitting alone on his anniversary. She thought about him coming here to remember his wife, hoping to hear music. That's all that mattered right now. Not her fears or her doubts or how she looked. She took a breath and began to play. The piece she chose was a simple classical melody, something most people would recognize even if they didn't know the name. Her fingers moved across the keys, tentative at first. She could feel how out of practice she was. There were little imperfections, tiny hesitations between notes, but gradually muscle memory took over. Her hands knew what to do. They'd played these patterns thousands of times. The familiar comfort of music settled over her like a warm blanket. The restaurant around her faded. She wasn't thinking about her aching feet anymore, or the dishes that needed clearing, or the fact that she'd been awake since 6 that morning. She was just playing, just making music. And something inside her that had been sleeping for a very long time started to wake up. She glanced up briefly and saw the old man watching her. There were tears on his cheeks, but he was smiling, really smiling. And in that moment, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples. Sometimes all someone needs is to know that another person cares enough to try. She had no idea yet that this simple gesture would change her entire life, that the melody floating through the restaurant right now was about to unlock a door she'd almost given up on opening. Sometimes the universe just needs to see that you're ready, that you're willing to take a chance, even when you're tired and scared and not sure if you have anything left to give. The song was almost over, but her story was just beginning. The simple melody flowed from her fingers like water finding its natural path. She'd chosen something safe, something that wouldn't demand too much after such a long day. But as she played, something unexpected began to happen inside her. The notes weren't just sounds anymore. They were memories. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting at her grandmother's upright piano on Sunday afternoons. The way the light came through the window and made patterns on the keys. Her grandmother's gentle voice saying, "Feel the music. Don't just play it." She remembered her first recital at 12, wearing a dress that was too fancy and shoes that pinched her toes, but feeling like the most important person in the world when she took her bow. She remembered late nights in the practice rooms at music school, when she'd stay until the building closed because she couldn't stop playing, when music felt like the only language that made sense, when she believed with absolute certainty that this was what she was meant to do with her life. When had she stopped believing that? Her fingers continued the familiar melody, but something was shifting. The song was coming to its natural end, but she didn't want to stop. She couldn't stop. There was something rising up inside her, something that had been buried under years of exhaustion and disappointment and just trying to pay rent. It was demanding to be let out. Without planning it, without even thinking about it, her hands transitioned into something different. Something more complex. Something that was hers. It was a piece she'd been working on for over a year, composing in fragments during those rare moments when she had energy to sit at her cheap apartment piano. She'd never performed it for anyone. It wasn't finished. It was just hers, this private thing she created in the spaces between shifts and sleep. But tonight it wanted to be played. Her fingers moved faster now, more confident. The melody built and climbed, notes cascading over each other like a waterfall. This wasn't background music anymore. This was something else entirely. This was everything she'd kept locked inside, finally breaking free. She poured herself into it. All the frustration of serving people who barely saw her. All the dreams she'd put on hold. All the times she'd walked past that piano and wondered what if. All the nights she'd been too tired to practice. All the moments she'd questioned whether she'd made terrible choices. It all went into the music. The piece grew more intense, more emotional. Her hands knew where to go even though she'd never played it all the way through like this before. It was like the music was using her, rather than the other way around. She was just the instrument now, and something bigger was flowing through her. She didn't notice that the conversations in the restaurant had stopped. She didn't see the couple at table 4 set down their forks and turn in their chairs to watch. She didn't notice the businessman at the bar close his laptop. She didn't see the kitchen door crack open and the cook peek out, his hands still wet from washing dishes. She was somewhere else entirely. In a place where only the music existed. The composition took her through valleys and peaks, soft moments that felt like whispers and powerful crescendos that made the wine glasses on nearby tables vibrate slightly. She played passages that she didn't even know she'd memorized, her hands pulling them from some deep place in her mind where they'd been stored and waiting. This wasn't perfect. She knew that. There were moments where her tired fingers stumbled slightly, where the notes weren't as clean as they could have been, but there was something raw and real about it that perfection could never capture. This was honest. This was true. As the piece built toward its climax, she felt tears on her own cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried while playing. Maybe never. Music had always been something she controlled, something she shaped and perfected. But this was different. This was music playing her. The final notes came almost too soon. She let them ring out, holding the pedal down so the sound filled every corner of the restaurant. The last note faded slowly, hanging in the air like smoke before finally disappearing into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Complete silence. She kept her hands on the keys, afraid to move, afraid to look up. What had she just done? She'd gotten carried away. She'd turned a simple gesture for one lonely man into something dramatic and probably inappropriate. She was supposed to be working, not having some kind of emotional breakdown at the piano. Then the applause started. It began with one person, then another. Then suddenly everyone in the restaurant was clapping. Not polite restaurant applause. Real applause. The kind she remembered from recitals and concerts. The kind that meant something. She finally looked up, her vision blurry with tears. People were standing. The couple at table 4, the businessman at the bar. Even her manager was standing in the doorway to the kitchen clapping. The cook was next to him, grinning and whooping. The old man was on his feet too, tears streaming down his face openly now. But he wasn't sad. He was beaming at her with a smile so bright it made her heart ache. He was clapping harder than anyone. She stood up shakily and gave a small bow, feeling ridiculous and wonderful and terrified all at once. Her face was hot. She was still wearing her apron with the restaurant's logo on it. Her hair was a mess. She probably had mascara running down her cheeks now. But none of that seemed to matter to the people applauding. A woman at one of the tables called out, That was incredible. Someone else yelled encore. She shook her head quickly, overwhelmed, and hurried away from the piano. She needed to get back to work. She needed to hide. She needed to process what had just happened. But as she passed the old man's table, he reached out and gently touched her arm. "Wait," he said. "Please." She stopped, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a gift tonight. You gave me back a feeling I thought I'd lost. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but thank you. I'm glad," she managed to say. "I just wanted you to have music for your anniversary. You gave me so much more than that." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to her. "I'm a retired music professor. Taught at the university for 35 years. I know talent when I hear it, and you have something special. Something rare. Please take my card. I'd like to help you if I can." She took the card, not really processing what it said. Her mind was still spinning from everything that had just happened. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She told him, and he wrote something on the back of another card before handing it to her too. "That's my personal number. Call me. Promise me you'll call." She nodded, tucking both cards into her apron pocket. As she walked back to the server station, she felt like she was floating. Her feet still hurt. She was still exhausted. She still had 2 more hours of her shift left. But something fundamental had shifted. Something had cracked open inside her that she'd thought was sealed shut forever. She caught her reflection in the mirror by the kitchen door. Same stained shirt, same tired eyes, but there was something different there now, too. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. She had no idea that across the restaurant, a man in a business suit was already pulling out his phone to make a call about the talented pianist he'd just discovered. She didn't know yet that this one moment of courage was about to open doors she'd stopped believing existed. But she felt it. Something was changing. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She moved through the motions of clearing tables and bringing checks, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Her hands still tingled from playing. Every time she walked past the piano, she felt a pull toward it like a magnet drawing her back. Customers kept stopping her as she worked. The woman from table 4 grabbed her hand and told her she had goosebumps. A businessman pressed an extra 20 into her palm and said, "For the music." An older couple who'd been celebrating their own anniversary told her they'd never forget this evening. The tips she made in those last 2 hours were more than she usually made in an entire shift. But it wasn't about the money. Something deeper had shifted. When the restaurant finally closed at 11, she hung up her apron with shaky hands. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by exhaustion that went bone deep. She'd been at work for 13 hours. Her manager caught her before she left. "I had no idea you could play like that," he said, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" She shrugged. "I guess it never came up." "Well, if you ever want to play on weekend nights, we could work something out. Maybe pay you a little extra." People loved it. She thanked him and said she'd think about it, but her mind was already elsewhere. As she walked to her car in the dark parking lot, she pulled out the business cards the old professor had given her. Under the streetlight, she read them properly for the first time. His name was printed in simple letters. Professor of Music, retired. The university name was one she recognized, prestigious and well-respected. On the back of the second card, he'd written a phone number and a note in shaky handwriting. "Please call. I mean it, you have a gift." She sat in her car for a long time staring at those cards. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as an old man being kind. But another part, the part that had just poured her soul into that piano, knew he'd meant every word. When she got home to her tiny apartment, it was almost midnight. She should have gone straight to bed. But instead, she found herself sitting at her old piano, the one with the sticky key and the slight buzz in the high register. She played her composition again, the one she'd performed at the restaurant. It flowed even better now, like something had been unlocked. She played until 2 in the morning, lost in the music, not caring that she had to be back at work in 8 hours. For the first time in years, playing didn't feel like another obligation. It felt like breathing. The next morning came too soon. She dragged herself through another shift, serving breakfast and lunch crowds with eyes that felt full of sand. But something was different. When customers were rude or dismissive, it didn't sink into her the same way. She had something they couldn't touch now, a reminder that she was more than just someone who brought them eggs and refilled their coffee. During her break, she finally worked up the courage to call the professor. Her hand shook as she dialed. Part of her hoped he wouldn't answer, that she could just leave a message and avoid the awkwardness of talking to him. But he picked up on the second ring. Hello? Hi, this is the waitress from last night. From the restaurant. You gave me your card and told me to call. Oh, his voice brightened immediately. I'm so glad you did. I was hoping you would. Listen, I know this might sound strange, but would you be willing to meet me for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. They arranged to meet the next day, her day off. She spent the entire time until then swinging between excitement and terror. What if he'd changed his mind? What if he'd just been caught up in the moment? What if she'd somehow misunderstood? The coffee shop he'd suggested was near the university, a cozy place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. She got there early and ordered tea she didn't drink, just held the warm cup in her hands while she waited. When he arrived, he had a folder under his arm and that same kind smile from the restaurant. Thank you for meeting me, he said as he sat down. I've been thinking about your performance since that night. Couldn't get it out of my head, actually. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. I want to be straight with you, he continued. I taught music for 35 years. I've heard thousands of students play. Some were technically perfect, could play anything you put in front of them without a single mistake. But very few had what you have. That raw emotional honesty, that ability to make people feel something. Her throat felt tight. Thank you. The piece you played, the complex one. Did you compose that yourself? Yes, she admitted. I've been working on it for a while. It's not finished. It's remarkable. He opened his folder and pulled out a piece of paper. I took the liberty of making some calls. There's a performing arts center downtown that runs a program for emerging musicians. They provide performance opportunities, mentorship, connections to the music community. I wrote you a letter of recommendation. She stared at the letter, unable to process what she was seeing. But you barely know me. I know your music, he said simply. And I know talent when I hear it. You need to audition, of course. But with this letter and your obvious ability, I think you have a very good chance. The audition was scheduled for 2 weeks later. 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. She practiced every spare moment, her fingers flying over the keys of her cheap piano until her downstairs neighbor banged on the ceiling. She requested time off from the restaurant, the first time she'd taken a day off in over a year. The night before the audition, she barely slept. She kept running through her pieces in her mind, terrified she'd forget something. What if she froze? What if her nerves got the best of her? This felt bigger than anything she'd done before. More important, like her entire future was balanced on what happened tomorrow. But when she walked into the audition room the next day and saw the grand piano waiting for her, something calmed inside her. This was familiar territory. This was home. 3 people sat at a table with notepads. They introduced themselves, asked her a few questions about her background and training. Then they asked her to play. She chose 3 pieces. A classical selection to show her technical skill, a contemporary piece to show her range, and finally her own composition, the one that had started everything at the restaurant. As she played her original piece, she wasn't thinking about the people judging her. She was back in that restaurant, playing for an old man who missed his wife, playing because something inside her demanded to be heard. The music flowed through her like it had that night, honest and raw and real. When she finished, there was a long pause. One of the judges was wiping her eyes. The man in the middle was nodding slowly. The woman on the left was scribbling notes frantically. That was your own composition? The man asked. Yes. How many original pieces do you have? She thought about it. Fragments and half-finished melodies scattered across notebook pages and voice memos on her phone. Maybe 15? Some are more complete than others. The judges exchanged glances. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. Thank you, the woman said. We'll be in touch within a week. She left the audition with no idea whether she'd done well or poorly. The waiting was torture. She went back to the restaurant, back to carrying plates and forcing smiles, but everything felt different now. Like she was standing at the edge of something, waiting to either fall or fly. 6 days later, she got the call. They wanted her in the program. They had performance slots available starting next month. They wanted to feature her original compositions. She sat on her bed holding the phone long after the call ended, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Happy tears this time. Grateful tears. Tears for every hard year that had led to this moment. Tears for the girl who'd almost given up on her dreams. Everything was about to change, and this time she was ready. The first performance at the Art Center was on a Thursday evening in October. She stood backstage wearing a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store, listening to the murmur of the audience filling the seats. Her hands were cold and sweaty at the same time. She kept wiping them on her dress, knowing it probably wasn't helping, but unable to stop. A woman with a clipboard and a headset poked her head backstage. 5 minutes, she said with an encouraging smile. 5 minutes until everything changed. 5 minutes until she walked out onto that stage as a real performer. Not just a waitress who happened to play piano. The distinction felt enormous. She'd cut back her restaurant shifts to 3 days a week. It meant less money, and her bank account made her nervous every time she checked it. But the program provided a small stipend for performers, and she'd started teaching piano lessons to a few kids in her neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. The retired professor had come to one of her practice sessions earlier that week. He'd sat in the empty theater and listened to her run through her pieces, offering gentle suggestions here and there. Mostly he just encouraged her to trust herself. "You're trying too hard to be perfect," he'd said. "Let the imperfections be part of the story. That's what makes your music special. It's human." Now, standing backstage, she tried to remember those words. Her music was human. That was okay. That was the point. 2 minutes, the clipboard woman called. She closed her eyes and thought about that night in the restaurant. How she'd been so tired she could barely stand. How she'd almost said no to covering that evening shift. How close she'd come to missing everything that happened after. Life was strange that way. The most important moments often came disguised as ordinary ones. "You're on." She walked onto the stage and the lights were brighter than she'd expected. She couldn't see most of the audience, just shadowy figures beyond the glare. The piano waited for her. Another grand piano, as beautiful as the one at the restaurant. She sat down, adjusted the bench slightly and took a breath. Then she began to play. The first piece was one she'd composed recently, inspired by everything that had happened. It started soft and uncertain, like someone taking tentative steps into unknown territory. Then it grew stronger, more confident, building into something powerful and sure. It was the story of finding courage when you thought you had none left. As she played, the nervousness fell away. This was what she was meant to do. Not perfect, not trying to impress anyone, just honest, just real. Just her, telling her story the only way she knew how. The audience was completely silent when she finished. Then the applause came, washing over her like a wave. She stood and bowed, and for a moment she let herself really feel it. Pride, joy, relief, gratitude. She played 2 more pieces, including the one from the restaurant. When that one ended, she heard someone in the audience call out, "Beautiful," and she had to blink back tears. After the performance, people came up to talk to her. A woman asked if she gave lessons. A man who ran a small music venue said he'd love to book her for a show. Someone else asked if she'd recorded any of her compositions yet. The questions and compliments blurred together, overwhelming and wonderful at the same time. The professor found her in the crowd, his eyes shining with pride. "You were magnificent," he said. "Your wife would have loved that music," she told him. "She would have," he agreed. She always said music was how the heart speaks when words aren't enough. Over the next few months, opportunities grew slowly but steadily. She performed at the Arts Center twice more. She got a gig playing at a wine bar on weekend evenings, which paid better than waitressing and let her choose her own repertoire. A local radio station featured her on a segment about emerging artists. Someone shared a video of one of her performances online and it got thousands of views. None of it was overnight success. She still struggled to pay rent some months. She still had moments of doubt, lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering if she was crazy to think she could actually make this work. She still kept one shift at the restaurant, partly for the steady income and partly because she didn't want to completely let go of what had been her anchor for so long. But something fundamental had changed. She was a musician who happened to waitress sometimes, not a waitress who happened to play piano. The difference seemed small but felt enormous. One evening, almost 6 months after that night at the restaurant, she got a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, thinking it was spam, but something made her pick up. "Hi, I'm calling from the Art Center," a woman's voice said. We're putting together a special showcase of original compositions by local artists. It's going to be recorded and streamed. We'd love for you to be part of it. You'd have a 20-minute set, all your own pieces. 20 minutes. An entire set of just her music. Her compositions, her voice, her story. She said yes before the woman even finished explaining the details. The night of the showcase, the theater was packed. She recognized faces in the crowd. Her manager from the restaurant had come, along with 2 of the other servers. Some of her piano students and their parents were there, regular customers from the wine bar. The professor, of course, sitting in the 3rd row with a handkerchief in his hand that she knew he'd need before the night was over. And in the back, standing near the door, she spotted the old man from that first night, the widower who'd asked if anyone played the piano. She hadn't seen him since, but somehow he'd heard about the showcase. When their eyes met, he raised his hand in a small wave and smiled. She played 5 pieces that night. Compositions that told the story of struggle and hope, of dreams deferred and then reclaimed, of finding yourself when you thought you were lost. The audience listened with the kind of attention that made the air feel electric. You could have heard a pin drop between songs. For the final piece, she played something new, something she'd written just the week before. It was called The Gift, and it was about how one small act of kindness can change everything. About how sometimes the moments that matter most are the ones we almost miss. About how courage can look like sitting down at a piano when you're exhausted and scared, and not sure if you have anything left to give. When she finished, the audience was on their feet before the last note fully faded. The applause was deafening. She stood and bowed, tears streaming freely down her face, not caring who saw them. This was joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Backstage after the show, her phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from friends, a text from a music blog asking for an interview, an email from someone asking about booking her for a private event. The world was opening up in ways she'd stopped letting herself imagine. But the moment that mattered most was when the old widower found her by the stage door. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled her into a gentle hug. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." "We did it," she corrected. "None of this happens without you asking about the piano that night." He shook his head. "I just asked a question. You're the one who had the courage to answer. That was all you." As she drove home that night, she thought about all the small moments that had led here. Getting hired at the restaurant 3 years ago. Deciding to stay for that double shift even though she was exhausted. Choosing to play for a lonely widower on his anniversary. Every choice, every moment had been a step on a path she hadn't known she was walking. Her apartment still wasn't much. The piano still had that sticky key.